Let us pray. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our hope. Amen. Clearly, I'm not a good shepherd. Small g. Clearly. That I had the learning together planned out. I was going to talk about the sheep. I was going to talk about how one was missing and it was going to be found. It was all good to go. And then it goes off the rails. Because that's what happens when you introduce dogs and children to the sheep. Actually, that's generally what happens with sheep, I'm sure. I've never had to deal with sheep. I imagine it's a little bit like herding cats in a way. Although I understand they do follow. And yet there's this story of one being lost and what to do when the one is lost. The thing is, this story, this parable has context, doesn't it? You heard the introduction to the parable. The Pharisees are mad because Jesus hangs out with the wrong people. Sinners. Interesting side note to me. Jesus hangs out with the wrong people because he hangs out with sinners, according to the Pharisees. But according to the author of the Gospel of Luke, tax collectors and sinners. Now, just in case, to cover all my bases, because I don't want to be audited, people who work for CRA are fine people. But back in Jesus' day, they were not. They were collecting taxes for the Romans, right? And in fact, they were not only doing that, they were probably getting a little for themselves on the side, too. So they were considered to be the worst people, like sinners. The worst people. Generalizing, of course, that that's what they were doing. And judging certain people to be sinners, which is the thing that's happening here, isn't it? The Pharisees have determined who sinners are. And here's the thing. As you may recall, Jesus didn't just hang out with people who were bad. He hung out with people who were sick. He hung out with people who had all sorts of issues. Health, physical health, mental health, spiritual health. Jesus hung out with people who were lost and needed help. People who were judged by the Pharisees to be sinners. And tax collectors. This is part of this story that's always kind of troubled me a little bit about the ministry of Jesus, is that clearly the tax collectors and sinners have been judged, right? The Pharisees would judge them to be sinners. We also hear Jesus talk a lot about the Pharisees and their behavior. If Jesus is here for sinners and the people who need him the most, you'd think he would have spent more time with the Pharisees. But he doesn't. That we're aware of. I mean, he could. It's just not included in the story. That starts me to wonder why. In fact, it almost sets up this dynamic of Jesus demonstrates what it means to be a good shepherd, and the Pharisees are set up to appear as though they're not. And that makes me wonder even more why. Well, here's what happens. Jesus gets criticized for hanging out with the wrong people, with the sinners, the tax collectors, and he tells this parable. He tells three, actually. This little introduction is followed by three parables. The first is this parable, this story about the lost sheep. There's 100 sheep, one gets lost. In fact, all of the hymns I can recall, remember the hymn about the 90 and 9? One has gone astray. That's the word we tended to use in telling this story. One sheep went astray. The shepherd goes to find it, brings the sheep back. There are obvious questions there. What happened to the 99? Why did the shepherd just abandon them? I don't think they did. Shepherds tended to work together in those days, I'm sure, and so other people were obviously watching the other 99, non-issue. He comes back, there's a party. The second parable is about a woman who loses a coin in her house. And so she lights a candle, or she lights a lamp, and she tears the house apart trying to find it. She finds it, and then she invites all her friends in to have a big party because she found it. And the third is the prodigal son story, one of the most familiar of all of the stories that Jesus tells, about the son who demands his inheritance ahead of time and runs off with it and spends it all, wastes it apparently, on having a good time. How you can waste on a good time. Anyway, that's for another time. The point is, he spends all the money and he comes back. And Dad welcomes him back and says, the lost is found. He was dead and is alive again. His brother is not happy about it. You know how the story goes. He comes back. Dad welcomes him back, wants to have a big party. The son doesn't want to go to the party. And in the end, we don't know whether the son actually does go or not. It's left up to us to figure this out. These three parables all have a similar structure, don't they? Lost, found, party. Kind of. Lost, but in different ways. I think that's why we have three stories. They're lost in different ways, aren't they? Gone astray, accidentally lost, willfully left. They're found in different ways too. But then there's always a big celebration. And see, I don't think the celebration is just because they were found. I think the celebration is because they were restored. That's the thing about the healing stories of Jesus too, isn't it? It's not just about the physical healing stories. It's about the fact that the very act of the healing restores that person. Not just to themselves, but to their place in the community. That's the thing about the judging to be sinners that the Pharisees do. In those days, if you had any sort of disability or something bad happened to you, like an illness, or you got leprosy, God forbid, actually that was exactly it. It was your fault and God was punishing you for something. You'd done something. It was a punishment. And you'd been judged, and therefore you had something bad happen to you. How does that make you a sinner, exactly, other than through the judgment of somebody else? And that's the thing, is that Jesus doesn't just heal people, he restores them. He restores them to their place in the community, doesn't he? Isn't that what happens in each of these stories? The sheep is restored to the flock. The coin is restored to the purse, I guess. And the son is restored to the family. There's a catch, though, isn't there? Which I think kind of goes back to the Pharisees and their judgment of people and their not being a good shepherd. You can't be restored if the community is not willing to restore you. This first parable about the sheep is a really great example of that, because there was many and one is lost. What happens if the one is restored and the community goes, yeah, no, not having anything to do with that guy? What if the one that was lost because they didn't feel like they belonged in the first place? What if the point of this parable in particular isn't just that someone finds them and brings them back? It's the need for the community to then be welcoming, not even the right word, to embrace them and help them feel that they belong again. See, the great thing about having this story even setting it apart from the other two. In this season when our theme is about everything in between, right? It's the idea that it's not just this or that, it's the and, it's that they're together. Is that at any time in our lives, we are all of the characters in this parable. We are members of the community that seems blissfully unaware that somebody's lost. We are members of the community who are not only aware enough, one of us at least is willing to go out and find them. And we're the lost. And sometimes we're the lost who struggles to be restored. There's any number of reasons, and I get that sheep aren't particularly smart, and that's why we don't like to be likened to sheep. And I get that they wander off and get lost accidentally because they're not very smart. But what if the lost sheep, it's a sheep simply because it could be any means that they're lost? It could simply be that you didn't feel like you belonged, so you want... The Naked Pastor, one of my favorite cartoonists, if you're not familiar with The Naked Pastor, he's not called that for the reason you're thinking. Look him up. His actual name has gone right out of my head. But he's from the Maritimes. He's Canadian, and he writes these cartoons. I've used lots of them before, but I love I love his cartoons, particularly that relate to sheep and to this story. There's one, for example, that's the sheep are all in the sheepfold. There's big, pretty solid stone wall, and they've all got signs that say, "All sheep lives matter." And there's Jesus outside, trying to find the one sheep that's over the side of the cliff. And there's one where the sheep is over the side of it, and it's a rainbow sheep over the side of the cliff, and all the other sheep are up here, and Jesus is reaching down to the rainbow sheep, and the rainbow sheep is saying, "I'm not actually lost, I just felt like I didn't belong." There's a third one where Jesus has a sheep on his shoulders, like in the story, and it's a transgender sheep, and the flock is over there, and the flock is saying, "He's not lost, we kicked him out." I really wish he would do one where the sheep comes back and the flock is welcoming and embraces them and is glad to have them home. Because that's the point of the story, isn't it? That the sheep would feel like they're home. And it doesn't matter whether it's the rainbow sheep or the trans sheep, or it shouldn't matter whether it was just somebody that was just different and didn't feel like they belonged. It shouldn't matter if it was somebody who lost their way for any number of reasons. It shouldn't just because they lost their way from God. It can't, actually. I mean, yeah, we can lose our way from God, but God never loses us. God is always with us because God is in us. When we lose our way, we simply lose our connection to that idea, which is the whole point of Jesus, isn't it? That we've lost our connection with the divine Spirit, and Jesus shows us how to reconnect. And one of the best ways Jesus shows us how to reconnect is that we together reach out to each other. The Spirit's in each of us. We need to reconnect with each other. Then we could have a party. I think that's the point of the celebration. In each of these stories even. That the lost is not just found, but restored. Feels like they belong. Feels like they're connected. Feels like they're part of something again, from which they have become disconnected for whatever reason. One of the things we need to be most concerned about is, as a community, are we welcoming them? Again, welcoming is not good enough. I mean, it's one thing to simply say, yes, you're welcome here, come on in. It's another thing entirely to ensure that someone feels like they are part of something, that they belong. That we're willing to engage them and embrace them just as they are. It's the prodigal son story where we get the most connection to that piece. Because we never find out whether the brother says, sure, I'll come in to the party. Sure, I'll welcome him back. But in this story, we still have to wonder not just whether we're welcoming them back, but we're willing to reach out to them in the first place. Because we're all Jesus in the story, right? We're all the shepherd. As well as the community, as well as we're all of these characters, and there's tension in between them, isn't there? For us. Because sometimes we feel like we're lost. And sometimes we can see that person who's sitting by themselves over at the table over there, away from everyone else. Have we found out why? Have we bothered to connect enough to understand each other and to create that sense of community where we might feel like we belong? Where do you find yourself in this story? Do you find yourself in this story as one of the lost? Do you find yourself as the one who sees someone who is and reaches out? Do you find yourself as part of the community that welcomes others? That isn't just a closed system of 100 sheep, but is willing to be open to anyone, just as they are? These are the questions that ought to arise from this. And sometimes I think we see this story so easily as Jesus saves the lost. And that's it. Or we might see the story as, who exactly are the sinners? And why are they sinners? Because the way the story's been set up, somebody's judged them to be. Oh, goodness, are we the Pharisees? That's always a question with Jesus. Are we the ones who like our place and our power enough that we judge others? Who are we in this story? Who do we want to be in this story? Because the reality is that we at various times are going to be all of these characters. But even in being all of these characters, we still have an opportunity to create community, to engage each other, to love each other, to care for each other, to struggle to know each other, because we will. Grace is required. In fact, through all of these stories, in almost all of the stories of Jesus, particularly the parables that he leaves hanging at the end so that you have to figure out who you are, grace is what's required to ourselves and to each other.